Right, hello everybody. Welcome to tonight's talk from Devon Wildlife Trust. We're just going to give people a couple of minutes to get into the talk, so bear with us during that. We've got about 230 people have signed up for the talk. We don't always get that many, as many as signed up, but hopefully we'll get a good few. We've got quite a few of you here already. I guess just watch out for other talks from Devon Wildlife Trust. We have these relatively regularly, so we advertise them through our newsletter and on our website, so keep an eye out for those. Just give us an extra minute or so and we'll see how many more people come in. It's always the entertaining moment before we get started. I hope you've all had a lovely evening and the weather's holding for you wherever you are. Okay, we're a couple of minutes past 6, so I think we'll get started. Before we start, I'll give you a few little bits and pieces, but just to introduce myself. So I'm Ed Parferris. I'm Conservation Manager at Devon Wildlife Trust, and I oversee a number of our species reintroduction programs. So I've been leading on the Pine Marten project and help with beavers and wildcats, and I've been at Devon Wildlife Trust for over 11 years now. So really excited to be here this evening, have you all join us. We're going to be hearing from Cath Jeffs, our Wildcat lead, about the Wildcat and the Southwest Wildcat Project. I'm just going to take a few moments just to run through a few things, just to make sure tonight goes smoothly. So first things first, if we have any technical issues, as this is all online, please bear with us. We'll try and resolve it if we can, but if we really can't, we will contact you via email to reschedule that. So, but bear with us if that happens. Hopefully it won't. You'll notice that you're all muted. And I ask that you please remain so and keep your cameras switched off. We're also recording this call, this meeting. So if you, if you're unclear about that, unsure about that, then obviously feel free to leave if that's uncomfortable for you. If you want to switch your view, the view button, if you hover up to the top right of your screen, then if you move it from gallery to speaker, that'll make sure that you're focused on myself and Cath and the presentation. But if you would like subtitles to help you listen in on this, you can enable live transcript using the CC button on your menu. And guys, we're going to be taking questions after the talk. You can submit questions at any time during this talk using the chat function, which is, I think, at the bottom of the screen. If you click the chat icon and please use the default name at the top of the list, it says DWT Comms. It's got a little badger logo to send your question to. If you send anything to other members of the panel, it might not be asked. So please make sure you're sending it to the right people. If you click new chat and type the question you'd like to ask, and when your question's read out, we won't be including anybody's names. And obviously we'll have quite a few coming through. So we'll try and bring them together if we can. We might not have time to get through everybody's questions, but we'll try and get through as many as we can. Now, before we move on to the main event tonight, we'd like you to just take part in a short poll to find out what you think about reintroducing wildcats to the southwest. That should appear on your screen in just a moment. Just bear with us, hope you will get there. And it should show you a question, which is just your feeling on returning wildcats to the southwest. If you can suggest 5 if you're extremely happy about that, 1 if you're completely unhappy about that, and obviously anywhere in between as well, depending on how you feel. We'll just give that a moment or two for people to tick on that. It looks like we've got about 75 of you have gone through, so we're getting through that. We'll just give it 1 or 2 more moments for anybody who's uncertain. Okay. Right. Should we wrap that poll up? Let's see what the results are. So about just under 60% of you are completely happy about pine martens. I noticed there's a few of you who are unhappy as well, which is good to see. And in a way, we want to hear, the questions from you guys later on. Hopefully Cath's talk will help with that. But we're going to revisit this poll at the end of the talk, so do stay with us to resubmit at the end of this talk. Right then, it's my pleasure. If we can remove that from the screen, that'd be great. If it hasn't gone yet, just click the off button on the box. Right, it's my pleasure to introduce Cath Jeffs to you. Cath Jeffs is the project lead for the Southwest Wildcat Project. Cath's been working for many decades in conservation here in the Southwest. I'm sure many of you have come across Cath in her various roles, and she's been involved with species reintroductions in the past of Cirl Buntings, one of our very special species in Devon, and successful reintroductions to Cornwall and the likes as well. So Cath's really experienced in reintroductions and ecology in the Southwest. So it's my pleasure to introduce Cath and handing over to you to give the talk on the Southwest Wildcat.
Thanks, Ed. I'm not sure about the many decades of work, but yeah, certainly I've been around for quite a long time and working, a lot with Cirl Buntings, which is a brilliant species to work on. But yeah, really delighted to be here to share the work that we've been doing on wildcats. So I'm going to share my screen, and it's always a nervous moment whether it's going to work. So hopefully that's all up. So Southwest Wildcat Feasibility. So this is what I'm going to be talking around. And basically we've been looking at this for the last 2.5 years, and I can't go into all the details. So if you are interested in, learning more, we've got the full report that's available on the Devon Wildlife Trust website. So there's a Wildcat page that you can go on. And all that information is there, the report's there, and all the sort of associated reports are also there. So hopefully you can get more information. Okay, so European wildcat, it's our only native cat species that we've got left in the UK. But it's got actually quite a wide distribution across, and it's called European wildcat, and it has got quite a wide European distribution. And sort of the closest populations probably sort of Germany and Belgium and France. And there's, they go into Turkey and into the Caucasus. There's 2 subspecies. So we've got Felis sylvestris, and that's predominantly the species that you get across Europe. So so they've got quite a wide range. But if you're looking at the UK, there's only holding on in Scotland, but you can actually see where it's in blue, so it's potentially extinct, which is very sad. So wildcats, and I just want to sort of put into context what a wildcat is, and it's a very different, it's very different from your sort of familiar domestic cat. They're completely different species, but they share a common ancestor, but that was like 4.5 million years ago. And actually, domestic cats are actually descended from African wildcat, which again is a different species. So you think about domestic cats, and they can be quite colonial. You get high numbers together. They're very, they've domesticated themselves virtually, and they can see that there's a reason to be close to humans. They're a source of food, and in lots of ways they've trained humans to look after them. Whereas wildcats are very different. They're solitary unless they're breeding. They live at very low densities. They're very well adapted to life in Europe. They've got really thick coats. They can deal with the weather, and they're efficient hunters. But they're very different. And one of the other things around them is that wildcats they're true carnivores, and they will they only eat meat, and they need fresh meat, whereas again your domestic cat can eat a much wider range of food, and food that would potentially make a wildcat very ill. So very different species, and just want you to sort of be clear in your head that that's the case. So what do wildcats need? They're basically, as I said, carnivores, and so they need areas with really good widespread sort of prey, and particularly they are focused on rodents, but also rabbits. Where rabbits are available, that will be a favoured prey, and and that's often what they'll just focus on if rabbits are there. So that makes up 75% of the diet, and the rest is made up of other things, including sort of quite surprisingly things like invertebrates, and they will take some birds and amphibians and reptiles, but as I say, they're mainly small mammals is what they're going to be feeding on. So their name, Felis sylvestris, kind of gives an indication of the habitat that this animal also needs, because it's woodlands. So woodlands are really important because that is where in particular the females will be having their kittens. They're in a sort of pile of wood, or in a burrow, in a sort of an old fox burrow and things like that. But also what's really important is actually habitats adjacent to woodlands that are going to be rich in their prey. So rough grasslands and scrub, and having sort of connected sort of hedgerows between habitats is really important. So actually you can start seeing that the landscape that we've got in the southwest could potentially be really favourable to wildcats. And so that's something that we've been investigating. But, so again, we might have in the past thought of them in very, very remote areas and, big forests, but actually when you start looking at where wildcats are across Europe, that's not always the case. And actually agricultural land, it can be really good for them. So when we look at wildcat populations across Europe, we know that there's some, they're being impacted by various threats. One of them is road traffic collisions, and we know that that's a really big source of mortality for wildcats from research that's been done. We also know that human persecution is something that continues and obviously has an impact on wildcats, as does habitat loss and fragmentation. And also another threat is actually interbreeding with domestic cats, so hybridization. So we know across Europe, research has been going on, is that these are the factors that are sort of impacting wildcat populations. So again, we wanted to be mindful of that when we were doing our feasibility and investigating what these threats and how we might address them. So just to understand what went wrong with wildcats. So why are they not here? This is a species that used to be, from all the research we've done, it used to be widespread and relatively, sort of maybe not common, but they were, as I say, they were across England, they were in Wales, and they were, they were there within the landscape. But over the years, they've been really persecuted, and that's the main problem with the reason that this animal became extinct in England and Wales is through persecution. And this happened a long time ago, and actually in the 1500s, there was an act of parliament that saw wildcats as vermin, that there was a bounty put on their head, and this has really led to them being widely persecuted across the range. So and one of the reasons that they came into conflict with people is the fact that they actually are preying on rabbits. And because humans were at that time, rabbits were seen as a good source of food, that's where they then came into conflict. So there's a lot of evidence that this is, what happened. And we also have a lot of evidence from records that were kept of these bounties that were paid. So, for example, we know that in around Heartland, in Devon, that actually sort of around 300 animals had been killed within sort of quite a small amount of time. So these records have helped us understand that actually these wildcats were quite quite widespread. So this is what's happened in England, and there's the potential that there might have been sort of declines as well through habitat loss. But actually, when you start thinking about it and seeing where wildcats can live, they probably did quite well out of the farmland situations that were being farms would have been a really good source of food because there's lots of vermin and sort of rodents and things like that. So that probably would have been really quite quite attractive to a wildcat. But then they potentially then came into conflict with humans. So yeah, sorry tale really of human persecution. And then we obviously we probably again are quite familiar. Maybe we think about wildcats as being Scottish wildcats, and indeed at one point, sort of at the start of the 1900s, they were thought of as being a separate subspecies, which is subsequently that's not the case. But Scotland was their last sort of call it stronghold, but that's where they'd managed to hang on. And it wasn't because the habitat there was better, it was just that they hadn't been persecuted from there. But actually, even in Scotland, potentially if there hadn't been the World War I starting, we might have lost wildcats from there as well, because we know that the numbers were being sort of declining and quite fragmented. But when the war came along and the gamekeepers went off to war, there wasn't so much control going on, and so the wildcat numbers we know increased and started to sort of spread out again. But then things changed once again, so it's been a sort of real tale of ups and downs. And one of the problems has been is that because wildcats are so elusive, they're difficult, to find and to watch, it's been quite a sort of, heading towards extinction, but, without anyone really noticing. And so by the time that a lot of work was going on, sort of really investigating what was happening with the wildcats. So I think between 2015 and 2020, when they were really doing some intensive work, actually what they found is that there was 31 wildcats detected, but actually that they were there were far more hybrids, i.e. these animals which were wildcats combined with domestic cats. So unfortunately, this hybridization was found to have actually, it was the final straw for this animal, and they were in 2019 they were actually then declared functionally extinct because the majority of the population were these hybrid animals. So this is making them a critically endangered species in the UK, and they are, we can say that they are functionally extinct. And if we don't do if we don't do this conservation action, that they will disappear, which is such a shame because they are a fantastic species. So luckily in Scotland there's lots of work going on, and the Saving Wildcats project, and if you're interested, I'd definitely go on, look on their website and see what they're doing, because they're leading the way in sort of reintroducing wildcats or supplementing the population there, and what we're watching that really carefully and sort of learning from what they're doing. So just to again put it in context, why Southwest England? So it's not been a case of Devon Wildlife Trust thinking, oh, this we've done beavers, we've done pine martens, what next? The reason that we've done this feasibility is because Southwest England had been identified within a preliminary sort of report looking at suitable areas for wildcats in England and Wales. And this report by Vincent Wildlife Trust showed that Southwest England was was the best place in England to really focus for a reintroduction, and also areas in Wales as well. And there's a project going looking at Wales for wildcats as well. So there's various projects on the go here, but that's the reason that it came up. And one of the reasons that as well as habitat, there was also the fact that there's relatively low human numbers, and also a relatively sort of low density of high volume cars. So thinking back to one of the threats, which is road mortality, by going to an area with lower roads, lower road densities, this potentially is hopefully helping. If wildcats get released, then it's reducing that threat. So there's all sorts of things that have gone on beforehand to identify this area. So what we did is we wanted to really focus in a bit more on the area and really sort of, check, sort of some of the assumptions that have been made through this previous bit of work, but also to do some further investigations. So obviously with our questions that we're looking to answer are, is there enough connected habitats? Do we think that there's enough, sort of areas that are going to allow wildcats to flourish and also move through that landscape? Along with that is understanding around sort of prey, and is there a good prey availability? Another important thing, and this is something that comes up a lot in reintroductions, and we are following the IUCN and the national guidelines on how to do a reintroduction. And one of the key things that that is always coming up is, how do people feel about wildcats? Do we understand what their concerns might be? Are they excited? Are they sort of very nervous about it? So that was something that we wanted to explore. Another obviously big question is this question around interbreeding, because obviously we've got a lot of cats, lots of domestic cats out there. So for a lot of people, I think it's been that the feeling is, oh, it's hybridization, it's impossible to stop, it's inevitable. So we wanted to look at that in a bit more detail and explore it. And it's also looking at other risks. What risks could bring in wildcats? What impacts might they have on human activities? So that whether that's on stock, on this is an animal that isn't dangerous to people, I'll just say it, but but people might perceive it, especially around its, potentially it sounds a bit scary being called a wildcat. But also we wanted to understand what the risks, the wildcats would face, and also maybe explore a bit around how wildcats fit into the environment and what, how do they contribute to sort of our ecosystems. And then another really important question is understanding, where are we going to get these wildcats from that we, that we put back into this landscape, and how does that work? So a whole load of questions that we were wanting to answer, and I think our questions sort of expanded as the project went on, just sort of trying to sort of really get a feeling for it. So one of the first things was to looking at habitat, and luckily there's been several pieces of work that have gone on looking at this, including a PhD that Tom Dando did at Exeter University, and then we also did our own sort of analysis. So the map at the top is what Tom has identified as being connected wildcat habitat, and that's using sort of parameters that we know from populations elsewhere in Europe and where the wildcats are living, and and the proportions of sort of woodland and these more open habitats where they might be hunting and foraging for their food. So you can see actually there's quite a large area of habitat that potentially is really quite connected. So that was quite reassuring. And then what we did also was we then looked at it in a bit more detail, and the map at the bottom is where we feel the most connected habitats are, and potentially that might be the area that we would focus on for a reintroduction. But with all of this work, we felt that we've got enough for sort of like a minimum number that we'd need to start establishing a population. But actually, potentially, if the animals can spread through the landscape, which might be through several reintroductions, that actually we can sort of support quite a good population that could be sufficient. So that was really encouraging, and in a way, I've come away thinking, well, habitat's probably not the it's probably the easy bit, maybe, I don't know. So the other thing I didn't say is that we struggled to get some good data to look at sort of prey availability, and that's something that we've identified. If wildcat reintroduction is to go ahead, we will need to do some more work around prey availability, but there just isn't the data sets around it. So small mammals are very, very important because they underpin lots of predators, but there's really, really little information around it, and that needs to change, really. We've got to recognise how important these small mammals are. So the other thing we were wanted to do, as I say, was look at the social sort of aspects of reintroducing a species, and a species that's been missing for over 100 years. So, and it's a carnivore, it's it's a predator. So we had a student who was doing their degree, and she wanted to do some work around wildcats, and she did a really brilliant little survey to sort of try and understand how people viewed wildcats when we talked about wildcats, or we talked about woodcats, which is what used to be an old English name for them. And it was really interesting how people perceived, wildcats compared to woodcats. And this is exactly the same survey, but one talked about wildcats and one talked about woodcats. And if you look at the sort of the word cloud that she developed from it, you can see when you talk about woodcats, people have a much different, they have a much sort of rosier view of them, perhaps. And so this is something that we're looking at and thinking about, is the name important, and is that something that we need to consider moving forward? But I thought that was quite an interesting piece of work. And also the wildcat name, it's a little bit confusing because people could think of it, wildcats, as a feral domestic cat maybe, or wildcat could mean a leopard or a lion to them. So it's a bit of a confusing name, but it is how people refer to them across Europe. So what we also did is we commissioned a sort of an independent piece of work to look at how people viewed a wildcat reintroduction, and this was University of Exeter sort of were commissioned to do it, and a team of people we've worked with on other reintroductions, so they've got some really good experience of devising these, and what they did is they talked to a whole range of stakeholders first, and that would be farmers, people who've got poultry, cat owners, nature conservation, organisations, people who are working in animal welfare, all sorts of different people, and just got in a feel for what people were thinking about a wildcat reintroduction and how they view wildcats. And from this, they then devised a survey that went out to the wider public across, and again, all this was focused just on Southwest, so it wasn't wider than that. So it's very focused across the area. And the results from this were really interesting and are also invaluable for us to use if we go forward with a reintroduction or continue to develop the idea for a reintroduction. So what we found that actually the public is generally sort of, favourable to wildcat reintroduction. That doesn't mean that they wholeheartedly are going to support it, but they liked the idea. So, we had two surveys that we did. One was representative by gender and age across the Southwest, which was done through a marketing company, and one of them was more of an open sample, which was a slightly higher favourability. So whether that was because it attracted people who were more interested in wildcats, I'm not 100% sure. But also what we found is that if people, so as part of the questionnaire that was sent out to people, there was also sort of as part of it was about understanding where people's knowledge was around wildcats as a starting point. And what we found that is if you had a higher knowledge score of what a wildcat is, what it does, then you're more likely to support a reintroduction. And we also found that actually people who owned cats were also more likely to support a reintroduction. So this feeling that maybe they loved cats, so they're going to they were actually really interested in wildcats as well, which is really interesting to know. And it might be a whole new load of people who might be brought into environmental matters, supporting conservation. But not, obviously it's not unanimous. Not everybody was supported, and I think there's about 10% was sort of unsure about wildcats and were concerned about what their impacts might be. This didn't mean, they weren't in supportive of the environment. It just meant that they were concerned about wildcats. And a lot of these concerns were about their impacts on other species, and potentially also impacts on sort of, animals, livestock, and unknown cats. So, there's a sort of, a sort of wide range of views, but it's, but some of the concerns were very sort of localized to sort of, wildlife and existing animals, which was interesting. So the results from this, so from all this work that has been done, and again, if you're interested in the report, it's all on our website, so you can really get, see the details of it. But what we found, what the conclusions of the research team was that a wildcat reintroduction is a socially feasible prospect, however, with caveats. And one of the the things that they've identified are that we need to communicate how wildcats and their potential reintroduction could contribute to a healthier southwest ecosystem. So that was quite an interesting one. It sort of, it wasn't good enough, or for some people, it wasn't good enough that this is a species that has been persecuted by humans. So, potentially there's a moral obligation to bring it back. It was more around how does wildcats contribute to sort of, our ecosystems? How where do they fit in? Building knowledge around reintroduction and what wildcats are is really essential. And also another really interesting thing that came out of it was that people wanted to see sort of a conflict management plan in place before the start of a project. So this is looking at, right, well, before we bring this animal back, we need to sort of understand what the impacts might be, and how we might be addressed. And it's just really important that people feel that they're included in sort of like, developing this sort of plan, this sort of coexistence plan. And it also needed to include sort of, disease risks and, and what can be mitigated. And also, most people didn't really know anything about hybridization or the risk, but if they did, then they were very concerned about it, and they wanted to know how these were, how hybridization could be mitigated, and how we justify costs to do this. So I think this work has been really, really useful, and it really helps in our thinking about how we move forward with this project, which is really helpful. So I've just sort of kind of done, what some of the work we've done, and I just want to now go through sort of hybridization. And basically, as I say, hybridization has been, sort of, we know that it's the reason that we've lost our Scottish animals, but is it, but actually it's not as simple as that. So we know from looking across Europe that actually hybridization isn't inevitable, and that there are populations which have got, relatively low amounts of hybridization in them, or, sort of, and they're thriving and they're doing really well. And what's been really interesting is as sort of genetics and sort of our understanding about genetics has improved. What we can see is that the latest research is that hybridization is actually a relatively new thing. So, and actually domestic cats have been in the UK for over 2,000 years, and they've been living alongside wildcats, and both have been, sort of retaining their genetic integrity. So this is a new thing that's happened. So it's sort of, it's not like this is, it's inevitable. And what the feeling is that actually hybridization is the, is the sort of end point, but it's been brought about by a whole range of other things. And basically, we know in Scotland that potentially, even when the species became protected in 1988, there was still persecution going on. So what you've ended up with is a wildcat population that's under a lot of stress and pressure, and you've got sort of, animals, maybe if you've got a male who's who's got his range over several females, which is how they distribute themselves. If that male goes missing, then that creates an opportunity for interbreeding with a domestic cat. So it's actually hybridization as a result of low densities of wildcats. But we're learning more about this as we're going along. And probably what our thinking is that actually is by having a stable wildcat population, that's potentially your best defence against hybridisation. So this is something that, you know, we would need to think about if we were reintroducing them and making sure that we've got really, you know, healthy population. But we also need to sort of understand what's happening sort of with unneutered cats in the environment. So as part of this project, we've actually we try to sort of get some data around cats within the rural environment. And what was really quite surprising is actually, even though there's lots of data around owned pet cats, where we know that there's actually high vaccination and neutering rates within the pet population, we couldn't find any data on feral cats, or cats that are, you know, in the real, you know, they're not owned, they're in a rural, you know, environment. We talked to lots of sort of cat welfare organisations to try and, you know, see what they understood. And again, there was very little data. So it was really hard to get a feeling for how many cats are out there. So we did some camera trapping, and actually we did, you know, sort of, you know, potentially about, I think we had about 500 sort of camera trapping hours looking for cats, and we hardly found any cats at all, but we had high numbers of fox and you know, badgers and all sorts of other things, but very few cats. So we also then undertook a survey with farmers to see whether they had, you know, sort of insights that we could learn from. And this is where we feel that we have the potential to have, you know, unneutered cats coming into the environment, because a lot of farms have cats and they value those cats as well, because they do a job by, you know, controlling vermin. But actually those cats are often maybe unmanaged, not always, and that could be then where these cats, you know, cats can come into the environment. But also, one of the things that we learned from looking, you know, all our research and sort of talking to people, is actually sort of feral cats that come from domestic cats are actually not very well adapted to living wild. And there's a lot of, you know, so whereas you might have a wildcat living up to 9 years in the wild, domestic cats are, you know, very rarely sort of make it past 2 years, so they're not adapted to this lifestyle. They're much more needing humans. So I think, you know, with cats, you know, we need to understand our unneutered cats, and it's really important that we sort of continue to sort of grow that knowledge. And actually, this is where working with cat welfare organisations is going to be critical if we move forward. So also of you know, critical importance is understanding what you know, what bringing back this cat might mean for our, you know, very, you know, rich and valuable sort of wildlife that we've got out there. And, you know, this is, as I say, I worked in nature conservation for quite a long time. I've worked on birds. I'm not wanting to bring back an animal that's going to have a huge impact and be detrimental. So one of the things that we did is we did a lot of you know, talking to other people, and, you know, where wildcats are sort of living, you know, out there in Europe, and also did a extensive literature review looking at the, you know, what we know around wildcat ecology and their diet. And then using that information and thinking about the ecology of the species that, you know, you're trying to work out if there's an impact on, and trying to assess those ecological impacts again across the range. And we looked across, you know, the whole of southern England, really, where that map I showed you with the sort of the area mapped out across southwest England that came from Tom Dando. We basically looked across all that area, and we looked at all our European protected sites. We thought about the assemblages of animals that might be impacted. So yeah, quite comprehensive, but, you know, you can only find out what is being recorded, really. So what we felt, and again, this is, you know, this is from our sort of initial, you know, really sort of deep dive into it, was actually that, you know, there wasn't any evidence that wildcats would be negatively impacting habitats. But again, you know, that might not always be the case. But what we were finding is that there was, you know, what we found is that there's, we know that wildcats aren't going to prey on bats because there's just no evidence of them within their diet. We know that birds make up a small part of their diet, and we also, in this country, we know reptiles tend to be diurnal while wildcats are nocturnal. So our feeling is, and again, because we know that they live at low densities and their prey is made up of widespread species, they're basically, there isn't the potential for them to really impact, sort of threaten species. But again, we have to recognise we don't always know everything. One of the things that we're really interested in understanding is whether they'd make ecosystems better, and it's lovely to be able to say yes, by bringing it back it's going to really enhance habitats. Unfortunately, there's not been lots of research into sort of these sort of mid sort of smaller predators, but we do know that wildcats are very likely to take grey squirrels, so that could have a positive impact on woodland ecosystems. And we also, because they're such carnivores and so reliant on fresh meat, they could really be an indicator of small mammal health, which could be really helpful, because actually monitoring these small mammals is really difficult. So that's something that we want to needs to be explored more. I think as part of this project, we need to acknowledge that there may be issues. And again, looking across at what they're doing in Europe, we can see that, there's some brilliant sort of examples of how they've looked at, put into supporting communities to live alongside predators. And in this case, it's a slightly larger cat, so the lynx. So it's looking at, we know that wildcats could be attracted to poultry, so it's helping sort of people who've got poultry to keep their animals secure. We also have looked at the source of animals. So, but within Europe, there's currently a UK captive wildcat population, but we've taken some sort of advice from the IUCN Cat Specialist Group, who've suggested that we might want to think about bringing in some more genetic diversity and bringing maybe some animals that from Europe. So again, that's something to explore, and it's quite an interesting sort of idea to actually be, and we know that our captive population has probably gone through quite sort of genetic bottlenecks at times. Also, what's really which I've been inspired by with looking across Europe and what they're doing, is that while they've been using, this is from an example from Germany, in that wildcats have been using to really drive forward ecological change and habitat improvements. So that would be really exciting if we could do that, because wildcats potentially are quite an exciting species. Again, this is an example from Austria, where the species was extinct and it's now recolonized. And I was really impressed to see that they built this wildcat camp for young people, and it's actually booked up until 2027. So it's really sort of caught people's imagination, and that's really exciting that we could do something similar. So just in conclusion then, so our conclusions is that, we do feel that Southwest could be suitable for a reintroduction. We've actually sort of created a sort of clear route of what we need to do by using, our social feasibility, understanding about potentially putting, a management plan in place. We know risks can't be completely ruled out, for example, hybridization, but we do not feel like it's, something that can't be addressed, and it shouldn't stop us trying. And we also know that without our help, wildcats are not going to come to England. So it's we either help them or they're not going to get here. And I just want to sort of just highlight that we've got this lovely small cat, but there's a whole range of small cats in trouble across the world. And again, there's similar issues that are going on, and sort of for example, fishing cats are competing with humans for fish in India and Sri Lanka. But communities are finding ways to deal with it, and I think that's really inspiring and something to hold on to. And also, one of the biggest cat is again quite an inspiration to me, in that interestingly, sort of over the last 10 years, the tiger population has doubled in India, which is pretty extraordinary for a country that, is so densely populated, or is very populated. And their findings and their conclusions is it's about the attitude of people that matter. It's making space for these cats, and it can be done. So just finally, I just wanted to share with you a film that I took of a wildcat in Spain, that just sort of kind of highlights what I hope you can see it. I hope it's not like too wobbly. And it's my film, it's just from my phone, so it's a bit rubbish, but I just thought it really was lovely to see a wildcat out there in its natural habitat, and just out there doing its thing. And it's basically, this is a site where they put food out for golden eagles, and the wildcat has realised that he can get in there. If he gets in early, he can get a free breakfast. So we felt very privileged to see them. Thank you. So that's the end of my presentation. Sorry, it feels. I mean, it's a really big, complex sort of project that we've been doing, and so it's quite hard to sort of synthesize it down. So as I say, look in the report if you want to find out more, and I look forward to taking some questions. Thank you.
Right, thank you so much, Cath. That's been fascinating to hear, and amazing to hear all the work that's gone into that. We've got a load of questions that have come through. I'm going to get to them in just a moment. But I'd mentioned before that we'd come back to that question that we asked you before. So we're just going to pop up the survey question again for people. Can you please fill out your answers as relatively quickly as you can? Once again, 1 is that you're not happy with the idea of a wildcat release, and 5 is you're extremely happy with a wildcat release. So please go with that. We'll just give it a moment to wind through there. We've got just over, was that 85 responses? We'll just give it one more moment. And then I think, right, we've got to just over 90, 95. So right, well, let's stop it there. So it looks like we've got 68% that are extremely happy. We have still got the 3% or so that that's still unhappy about that. I'm hoping that you've put some questions into the chat. Right, if you can close that on your screen. Cath, just have a sip of water. Thanks for your talk. We've had a load of questions through. What I'm going to try and do is just summarise some of them for you. So we've got just over 10 minutes to run through those. First question I'm going to come to is one that came back a few times, Cath, which is around the impact of wildcats in terms of when we add them to foxes and raptors and other feral cats and things of that sort. Is that going to be too much pressure on our existing wildlife, particularly things like birds and small mammals?
It's a really good question. So I think with, bringing wildcats back will probably have an impact on feral cats, definitely, because wildcats are going to likely kick them out of their territories. They're definitely not going to want to share. And wildcats are, they are bigger and stockier than feral cats, so that will, have an impact. And we just know from, I do think if we're going to do this project, we also have to look at, making sure that we're recovering habitats as well, and making sure that we're improving, prey availability. But we also, there's interactions between predators that will, for example, pine martens are likely to, they're one of the biggest predator of wildcat kittens. And then the wildcats will then potentially sort of keep the adults away. So, our understanding of predator interactions is just gradually growing. But, I wouldn't want to be I think that we can be ensuring that we're making sure that there's plenty of food for everyone.
Yeah, brilliant. Thank you, Cath. Yeah, predator prey and predator predator interactions are really complicated, aren't they? And they're sort of never quite as simple as that little triangle we get taught at school, is it? So hoping there's a big balancing effect. That's our expectation there. had an interesting question about, is there a comparable environment in Europe which shows the sort of likely expected density of wildcats in Devon as we go forwards, and what sort of typical range might we expect them? I think you did touch on this a bit in your talk.
Yeah, I mean, so we were looking at comparable areas, sort of like in France, and I think I kind of sort of my rough working figure is that you'll get 3 to 5 wildcats per sort of 10 kilometre square, so that which again really illustrates that they're at a very low density. They're definitely not going to be huge numbers, but it'll all be based down to prey availability. So if there's more prey, then they're more likely to tolerate being closer together. And again, that is something that we've seen.
Yeah, no, that's I think that's sort of familiar territory in terms of what we might expect for other predators. I'll just answer a quick one just to give you a moment's rest around. Are there any plans to tackle the risks around roads? So actually, Devon Wildlife Trust is working with national highways and county highways to look at crossing features for wildlife crossing roads. Been working with them for a few years on that, and we've got a current project which is focused on pine martens, but it's actually triggering a whole load of conversations around other species. So it's not imminent, but I think there's a lot of work going into it, and there's a lot of work going on nationally around this. And national highways and county highway authorities are much more aware of this as a challenge for them to address, and particularly about rather than building big, expensive green bridges, instead adding features that enable wildcats or other species to cross roads safely using things like culverts or bridges that are out there already.
And
so
just to add to that, we know that in Europe, they're sort of in a way a bit in advance of us, and some of these things that they've put in place can really, really save wildcats and other wildlife life. So it's great that we're looking at it in more detail here in this country.
Absolutely. So we had a bit more learning from other places. So the question was sort of focused around what's to stop wildcats hybridizing with domestic cats, but can we learn from other places? And is it a bad outcome anyway? Was the question. So obviously you touched on this in your talk, but it's interesting thinking, sort of what could we tolerate in terms of hybridization with our wildcat population?
Yeah, so we know that in Germany they've got a huge pet cat population, probably the highest density in Europe, but they've also got really good flourishing wildcat populations as well. So we know that it can be done, and it's just understanding that. And the thing about hybrids is really interesting as well. I didn't have time to touch on that because it's another fascinating thing. We are going to have to accept that hybridization, we will get some hybridization, and what we're seeing is some hybridization as populations are expanding, because obviously they're moving into areas where there isn't wildcats, and they do, there is a bit of hybridization. But then what you find is that those hybrids are then back crossing with wildcats, so they become more wildcat again. I mean, I'm not an expert on genetics, but it's a fascinating field. And the other thing in Germany is that they protect their hybrids. So they're just as protected as wildcats because they're recognizing that there's a value on them, but also it's helping to stop any misidentification that could result in that hybrid being removed. And it's still holding really important genetic material.
Yeah, it's a fascinating field, isn't it? And something that we haven't really tackled to date in sort of our work, but there's a lot of work going on elsewhere, so plenty to learn from them. There's a few questions in about disease risks. What I'm going to suggest is we don't go into them here because I think they get quite technical. Cath, are we going to be publishing the disease risk analysis that's been done and any future sort of work around that? Because there's questions around the risk to domestic cats. There's questions about interactions with rodents and dogs and things of that sort. So I don't suppose we go through that now, but is that going to come online?
But I can say we have done a very comprehensive, it was completed by an expert in the field, very comprehensive disease risk analysis. And I was hoping it was going to be available, but it's not quite been published yet. But again, it will be on our website or a link to it once it is. So I would hope that that's within the next couple of months. And so if people are interested, please have a look at it.
Yeah, no, that's great. And it's all these documents are going to be gradually coming up on our documents and reports um, uh, page on the Devon Wildlife Trust website. So do have a look there for those coming up. Um, Question around obviously with conservation projects, reintroduction projects in Scotland, and the hopeful success of them. Should we be focusing our efforts there rather than doing this down in Devon and the West Country, and then look for success there first as as Wildcat's last location within this country?
Well, I don't think we should just, there's no reason that we should just do one. We can be looking and prepare. We're not talking about reintroducing animals anytime soon either. That's the thing to sort of make clear here. We're doing the, preparation for that and sort of gaining that understanding. So, I mean, I have no issue that we should be learning from that project, but also thinking about Scotland, it's a very different place to England. And if you think about some of the work that we've done on, other, raptors, for example, that were hanging on just in Wales, but then, sort of like red kites, and then actually the reintroduction into a whole new area sort of gave them a new lease of life. So I think we need to be doing all of these things. And I definitely, I'm so excited about what they're doing in Scotland, but I don't think that should stop us, progressing what we can here.
Yeah, and like you say, I mean, we know that wildcat are likely to thrive in our sort of environment. The fact that their last location is in Scotland doesn't mean that that's the best location for them. They're found in many different locations across Europe. So yeah, hopefully we can explore that as we go into the next phase of the project. Questions that came in, there's a couple of repeats on this, which were around: are there sufficient rabbit prey for wildcats following myxomatosis and the likes, and obviously the change in culture from when we used to keep rabbits for food on a widespread basis within this country?
I think the thing about rabbits is it's their favoured prey if it's available, and that and obviously they're big, and they'll keep if they put the effort into hunting a rabbit, it's sort of good use of their time. But yeah, they will they're probably they can be considered rodent specialists, so that's what they'll eat in the absence. And I'm really, again, I think we kind of obviously I'm working on a really big exciting animal, but we're also we need to think about the small mammals and voles and mice, and looking at making sure that we're restoring habitat, and like putting water voles back into the landscape as well, and things like that, because these animals are so important, and we really need to be ensuring that we're looking after them, and that then I think there should be plenty of prey for wildcats.
Yeah, no, that's great. I think last question, Cath, is just a bit of an explanation of the next steps and what sort of any timeframes for moving forwards on this.
Yeah, no, it's a good question. So we are, we're pretty committed as a partnership, which is, I should have said it at the beginning, shouldn't I? Basically, Devon Wildlife Trust, Forestry England, and Derek Gow Consultancy. But we are really, we want to sort of continue this work, keep the momentum going. We've had some fantastic conversations with, all sorts of stakeholders who've got really interested and potentially want to help us. So at the moment, our funding is finishing at the end of March, but we're looking to secure, additional funding to make sure we can continue that work. So watch this space, basically.
Brilliant. Cath, we're out of time. Thank you so much, everybody. Cath has given a wonderful talk. Keep watching for more information coming up on this. Keep looking out for other Devon Wildlife Trust talks, and hope to see you next time. All the very best, everyone. Thank you very much.
Thank you.